The flour-dusted hand of Eleanor Hayes had just closed around the loaf of bread when rough fingers clamped down on her wrist like iron shackles, and she knew with sickening certainty that her desperate gamble had failed. "Thief!" The baker's voice boomed through the general store in Prescott, Arizona territory, this scorching afternoon in July of 1883, his face purpled with rage, as he yanked Eleanor forward, nearly pulling her off her feet. "Sheriff! Someone fetch the sheriff!" Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as panic flooded through her veins. She could feel every pair of eyes in the store turning toward her, could hear the whispers starting like wildfire. Her worn calico dress, faded from too many washings and patched at the elbows, marked her poverty as clearly as a brand. At 22 years old, she had never stolen anything in her life until this moment, and shame burned her cheeks even as desperation clawed at her chest. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My sister, she has not eaten in 3 days. Please, I will pay you back, I swear it." "That is what they all say," the baker snarled, his meaty hand still gripping her wrist hard enough to bruise. "Deputy Williams, get over here!" Through the gathering crowd, Eleanor caught sight of a tall figure moving with deliberate purpose toward the commotion, but it was not the deputy. The man who stepped into the circle of onlookers wore dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a dark vest over a chambray shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed eyes the color of storm clouds. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to hard work and harder decisions, his sun-bronzed face weathered but undeniably handsome. A cattleman, Eleanor thought distantly, noting the rope calluses on his hands and the way he carried himself. "What is the price of the bread?" The cowboy's voice cut through the baker's bluster, low and steady as bedrock. The baker blinked, momentarily thrown off his tirade. "What business is it of yours, Garrett?" "The price," the cowboy repeated, and something in his tone made it less a question and more a command. 15 cents, the baker grumbled. "But that is not the point. The point is—" The cowboy reached into his vest pocket and produced a silver coin that gleamed in the afternoon light filtering through the store windows. He flipped it to the baker with a casual motion. "There is a quarter. Keep the change." His eyes, now fixed on Eleanor, held something she could not quite read. Curiosity, perhaps, or assessment. "Let her go." The baker's grip loosened, and Eleanor stumbled back, clutching the bread to her chest like a lifeline. Her legs felt weak beneath her, trembling with the aftermath of fear and the hollow weakness of her own hunger. She had given what little food they had to Clara, her 16-year-old sister, whose frail constitution had only grown weaker in the months since the fever took their mother. "Thank you," Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will repay you, I promise. When I can find work, when was the last time you ate?" The cowboy interrupted, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to shrink back. But there was no cruelty in his gaze, only a frank directness that seemed to strip away all pretense. Eleanor opened her mouth to lie, to say she had eaten that morning, but the words would not come. Instead, to her horror, tears began to spill down her cheeks. She had been so strong for Clara, had held herself together through their mother's death, through the loss of their small house when they could not pay the rent, through the endless rejections when she sought work. But this stranger's unexpected kindness, after the terror of nearly being arrested, shattered something inside her. 2 days, she admitted, her voice breaking. "But my sister needs it more. She is so weak, and I thought if I could just—" "Where is she?" The cowboy's question was immediate and practical. "Your sister?" "At the boarding house on 3rd Street, Mrs. Patterson's place. We have a room, but our rent is due, and I could not find work, and Clara is too sick to—" Eleanor stopped herself, realizing she was babbling. She straightened her spine, trying to reclaim some dignity. "I should go to her. Thank you again, sir. I am in your debt." She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her cold. "I am James Garrett. I run a cattle ranch about 10 miles north of town. I need workers." He paused, And when she turned back to face him, he continued, "My housekeeper quit last month to get married, and I have been managing on my own, which means the house is a disaster and I have been eating nothing but beans and hardtack for weeks. I need someone to keep house, cook, and help with the chickens and the garden. The work is hard, but it comes with room and board for two and wages of $12 a month." Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. It was too much, too sudden. Kindness like this did not exist, not in her experience. There had to be a catch, some expectation she was not seeing. As if reading her thoughts, James Garrett's expression hardened slightly. "It is honest work, and I am an honest man. Ask anyone in town about my reputation if you do not believe me. I treat my workers fairly, and I keep my word. If your sister is well enough to travel, you can both come out to the ranch today. If she needs a doctor, I will pay for that too, and you can start once she is recovered." "Why?" The question burst from Eleanor before she could stop it. "Why would you do this for a stranger? For someone you just watched try to steal?" James was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window and the dusty street beyond. When he spoke, his voice was lower, threaded with something that sounded like old pain. "I had a sister once. She died when I was 19 and she was 15. Scarlet fever. We were poor then, poorer than you can imagine, and I could not afford the medicine that might have saved her." His eyes returned to Eleanor, and she saw shadows there that matched her own fears. "I told myself if I ever had the means to help someone in that position, I would, so here we are." The simple honesty in his words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She saw the truth written in the lines of his face, in the set of his shoulders. This was not charity born of pity, but understanding born of shared grief. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said quietly. "My sister is Clara. And yes, Mr. Garrett, we accept your offer." "James," he corrected, "if we are going to be living under the same roof, we can dispense with the formalities. Now let us go see about your sister and get some food in both of you before you collapse. I saw a restaurant down the street." "I cannot possibly impose further in..." Eleanor began, but her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying her. A hint of a smile crossed James's face, the first she had seen, and it transformed his features from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. "It is not an imposition. It is practical. I need workers who have the strength to work. Come on." He guided her out of the store with a hand at her elbow, his touch careful and respectful, and Eleanor found herself following this stranger who had, in the span of minutes, changed the entire trajectory of her life. The restaurant was small but clean, and the smell of cooking food nearly made Eleanor dizzy with longing. James ordered beef stew, fresh bread, and coffee for both of them, along with extra portions to take to Clara. As they waited for the food, Eleanor found herself studying him covertly across the wooden table. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she guessed, with the kind of solid build that came from years of physical labor. His hands, resting on the table, were work-roughened but clean, the nails trimmed short. He had removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that waved slightly where it was pressed down by the band. There was a small scar through his left eyebrow, pale against his tanned skin, and she wondered what story it held. "How long have you been in Prescott?" James asked, pulling her from her observations. 3 months, Eleanor replied. "We came from Tucson after our mother passed. I thought there might be more opportunities here, more chance of work, but every position I applied for was already filled, or they wanted someone with experience, or they did not want the complication of two of us." She twisted her hands in her lap, the shame of their circumstances still raw. "I have been doing odd jobs when I can find them, laundry, mending, cleaning, but it has not been enough." "What happened to your father?" "He died in a mining accident when I was 10. Mother did her best, worked as a seamstress, but after the fever took her strength, she never fully recovered. Clara was always delicate, even as a child. The fever almost killed her too, and she has not been the same since." The food arrived then, steaming bowls of rich stew, thick with vegetables and chunks of tender beef. Eleanor tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some semblance of manners, but her body screamed for sustenance. She had not realized how hungry she was, how the constant gnawing emptiness had become something she simply endured. "Eat," James said simply when he noticed her hesitation. "There is no judgment here." So she ate, and with each bite she felt strength returning to her limbs, clarity returning to her thoughts. James ate his own meal in comfortable silence, not pressing her with questions or conversation, and she was grateful for it. When they finished, James paid the bill and collected the extra portions wrapped in paper. Together they walked to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, a shabby two-story building that had seen better days. Eleanor's stomach twisted with anxiety as they climbed the narrow stairs to the tiny room she shared with Clara. "Clara?" she called softly as she opened the door. "I am back." The room was barely large enough for the narrow bed and single chair it contained. Clara lay on the bed, her face pale as paper against the thin pillow, her blonde hair limp with sweat despite the heat of the day. At 16, she should have been blooming into womanhood, but illness and hunger had left her looking like a wraith. "Ellie?" Clara's voice was weak, her blue eyes fluttering open. "Did you find work?" "Better than that," Eleanor said, kneeling beside the bed and unwrapping the food. "I found us a home, but first you need to eat. Can you sit up?" James stood in the doorway, and Eleanor saw something flicker across his face as he looked at Clara. Recognition, perhaps, of his own lost sister in this frail girl's features. He cleared his throat. "I will go speak with Mrs. Patterson about settling your account and arranging for your things to be brought to the ranch. Take your time." After he left, Eleanor helped Clara sit up and held the bowl while her sister ate small, careful bites. As she ate, Eleanor explained everything that had happened. The attempted theft, James's intervention, the job offer. "He just offered us work?" Clara asked, her voice stronger now that food was warming her belly. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Eleanor confirmed. "I know it seems too good to be true, but Clara, I believe him. I looked in his eyes and I saw something real there, something honest. And everyone in the store seemed to know him, seemed to respect him." "You looked in his eyes?" Clara's lips curved into a small smile, the first Eleanor had seen in weeks. "Is he handsome?" "That is hardly relevant," Eleanor said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "What matters is that we have a chance now, a real chance." "But is he handsome?" Clara pressed, a hint of her old mischief returning. Eleanor sighed. "Yes, he is handsome. Now finish eating so you can gather strength. We have a wagon ride ahead of us." By the time James returned, Clara had eaten her fill and was looking more alert than she had in days. James's expression softened when he saw the improvement, and he nodded with satisfaction. "Mrs. Patterson has been paid through the end of the week, though we are leaving today," he said. "I told her to donate anything you cannot take to the church. My wagon is out front. Do you think you can manage the ride, Clara?" Clara nodded, and Eleanor's heart swelled at the gentle way James addressed her sister, not talking down to her but treating her with respect despite her age and condition. They had few enough possessions that packing took only minutes. 2 changes of clothes each, a hairbrush that had been their mother's, a Bible, and a small daguerreotype of their parents on their wedding day. Everything they owned fit into a single small trunk that James lifted easily and carried down to the wagon. The wagon itself was well maintained, the 2 horses that pulled it clearly healthy and well cared for. James had laid out blankets in the back to make it more comfortable, and he helped Clara climb up with careful hands before turning to assist Eleanor. As his hands closed around her waist to lift her up, Eleanor felt a jolt of something she could not quite name. Awareness, perhaps, of his strength, of the warmth of his touch, even through the fabric of her dress. Her hands rested briefly on his shoulders, and for just a moment their eyes met. His were still storm gray, but now she saw other things in them. Kindness, yes, but also a hint of loneliness that called to something deep within her own heart. Then the moment passed, and she was seated in the wagon, and James was climbing up to the driver's seat, taking the reins in his capable hands. The ride north out of Prescott took them through high desert country, scrub brush and juniper giving way gradually to pine trees as they climbed in elevation. The air was clearer here, cooler, and Eleanor breathed deeply, feeling as though she could finally fill her lungs properly after months of shallow, anxious breathing. James pointed out landmarks as they traveled: a distinctive rock formation, the turnoff to a neighboring ranch, the creek that ran through his property and provided water year-round. He talked easily, his voice low and pleasant, and Eleanor found herself relaxing into the rhythm of his words and the creak of the wagon wheels. "The ranch has been in my family for 8 years now," he explained. "My father and I built it up from nothing after the war. He passed 3 years ago, left it all to me. It is not the biggest spread around, but it is profitable. I run about 300 head of cattle, have 5 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, and manage to keep everything running smoothly, more or less." "It sounds wonderful," Clara said from the back of the wagon, her voice dreamy. "I have never lived anywhere but towns." "It is isolated," James warned. "The nearest neighbor is 4 miles away and town is 10 miles. Winter can be harsh, though not as bad as some places. But if you like peace and quiet and do not mind hard work, it is a good life." The ranch, when they finally reached it in the late afternoon, exceeded Eleanor's expectations. The main house was a solid structure of pine logs with a wide porch and real glass windows. Nearby stood a barn, a bunkhouse, and various outbuildings, all well maintained. A garden plot showed signs of attempted cultivation, though weeds had clearly won several battles. Chickens scratched in a fenced yard, and beyond the immediate buildings Eleanor could see grazing cattle dotting the rolling grassland. "Home?" James said simply, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Welcome to the Garrett Ranch." He helped them down and carried their trunk inside, leading them through a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. The space was indeed in need of a woman's touch. Dust covered most surfaces. Dishes were piled in the dry sink, and the floor looked like it had not been properly swept in weeks. But the bones of it were good. Solid furniture, a large stone fireplace, windows that let in plenty of light, and a cast-iron stove that looked new. "There are 2 bedrooms, Kikijin," James said, gesturing to doors on opposite sides of the main room. "The larger one has been mine, but you 2 should take it. It has a bigger bed and more space. I will move my things to the smaller room. There is a privy out back, and the well is right outside the kitchen door. The bunkhouse has its own facilities, so you will not be bothered by the ranch hands. I run a respectable operation. No drinking, no gambling, no bad language around the house. Any man who causes trouble gets one warning, then he is gone." "We cannot take your room," Eleanor protested, but James shook his head. "You can and you will. Clara needs space to recover properly, and you both need privacy. It is not up for discussion." His tone was firm, but not unkind. "Now I will give you time to settle in and rest. I need to check on the herd and talk to my foreman. There is food in the pantry. Help yourselves to whatever you need. I will be back before dark." He left them then, and Eleanor and Clara stood in the center of the main room, looking at each other in wonder. "Ellie," Clara whispered, "is this real? Are we really going to live here?" "It is real," Eleanor said, and suddenly she was laughing, a sound of pure relief and joy that bubbled up from deep inside her. "We are going to be all right, Clara. Finally, we are going to be all right." They explored the house thoroughly, exclaiming over luxuries they had not expected. Real beds with thick mattresses, multiple quilts, shelves of books, even a small collection of dishes and cooking pots that were better than anything they had owned. The pantry, as James had said, was well stocked with staples: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, sugar, salt, canned goods, and even some preserved fruits. By the time James returned that evening, Eleanor had swept the main room, started washing the accumulated dishes, and put together a simple supper of fried eggs, bread, and reheated beans. It was not fancy, but it was hot and filling, and the expression on James's face when he walked in and smelled real cooking made all her effort worthwhile. "I had forgotten what it was like to come home to a cooked meal," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Thank you, Eleanor." They ate together at the rough wooden table, and conversation flowed more easily now. James asked about their lives before Prescott, and Eleanor found herself telling stories about their childhood, about their mother's kindness and their father's laughter. Clara, growing more animated with proper food in her belly, chimed in with her own memories, and Eleanor saw James's expression soften as he listened. In turn, James talked about building the ranch with his father, about the challenges of those early years, about slowly growing the herd and establishing their reputation for quality beef. He talked about his sister Sarah, about her love of wildflowers and her terrible singing voice, and Eleanor heard the grief that still lived in his voice, even after all these years. "She would have liked you both," he said quietly as the evening light faded and Eleanor lit the oil lamps. "She always wanted sisters, wanted a house full of family and noise." "Tell us more about her," Clara said. And so he did, sharing memories until the stars came out and weariness finally pulled at all of them. That night, lying in the comfortable bed beside her sleeping sister, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she had been desperate enough to steal. Tonight she lay safe and fed in a real home, with honest work promised and a future that held hope instead of despair. And then there was James Garrett himself, the cowboy with storm-gray eyes and careful hands, who had seen her at her worst and offered her not judgment but opportunity. She barely knew him, and yet something in her recognized something in him, a matching loneliness perhaps, or a shared understanding of loss. She told herself it was gratitude she felt, nothing more. Gratitude and relief. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was his face she saw behind her closed eyelids and the memory of his rare smile that warmed her. The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of needing to make the most of every moment. She dressed quietly to avoid waking Clara and emerged into the main room to find James already up, building a fire in the stove. "You're up early," she said, and he glanced over his shoulder with a nod. "Ranch life starts early. I was going to make coffee, but I will confess my coffee-making skills are limited to boiling water and hoping for the best." Eleanor smiled and moved to take over. "Let me. You have done enough for us. It is time I started earning our keep." She shooed him to the table and set about making proper coffee and frying salt pork and cornmeal mush for breakfast. As she worked, she was aware of his gaze on her, not intrusive but present, and she found herself standing a little straighter, moving with more care. When she set the plate before him, his eyes widened. "You can actually cook." "Did you think I was lying about that?" "No, but there is a difference between can cook and can cook well. This is the latter." He took a bite and made a sound of appreciation that sent unexpected warmth through Eleanor's chest. "If all your meals are like this, I am never letting you leave." The words were teasing, but something in Eleanor's heart caught at them nonetheless. She busied herself with her own plate to cover the confusion of her feelings. Over the next days and weeks, a routine established itself. Eleanor rose early to make breakfast for James before he headed out to work with his cattle and ranch hands. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, tending the garden and chickens, and gradually bringing order to the neglected household. Clara, growing stronger with regular meals and rest, helped with lighter tasks, mending, gathering eggs, shelling peas. The ranch hands were a weathered collection of men ranging from weathered old cowboys to younger drifters, but true to James's word, they were respectful and caused no trouble. They ate their meals in the bunkhouse, though James took his at the main house with Eleanor and Clara, and those evening meals became the highlight of Eleanor's day. James was easy to talk to, she discovered. He had opinions on everything from politics to the best way to fix a fence, and he listened to her thoughts with genuine interest, never dismissing her ideas simply because she was a woman. He taught them both about ranch life, pointing out different cattle breeds, explaining the seasonal rhythms of the work, sharing stories about particularly ornery steers or close calls during roundups. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Eleanor began to notice other things. The way James always made sure she had help with the heavier chores, sending one of the ranch hands to chop wood or haul water. The way he brought wildflowers in from his rides and left them on the table without comment, though she saw him watching her face when she discovered them. The way his hand would linger just a moment longer than necessary when he passed her something at dinner. The way her own heart had started beating faster when she heard his footsteps on the porch. The way she caught herself watching for his return in the late afternoon. The way his smile had become something precious to her. It was Clara who finally said what Eleanor had been trying not to acknowledge. "He is in love with you," her sister announced one afternoon as they worked together in the garden, pulling weeds from around the squash plants. Eleanor's hands stilled. "What?" "No. He is just kind. It is who he is. Ellie, he looks at you the way Father looked at Mother in that photograph, like you are the answer to every question he never knew he was asking." Clara sat back on her heels, her face more serious than Eleanor had seen it in months. She had filled out with regular meals, her cheeks showing color again, her movement stronger. "And you look at him the same way." "I cannot," Eleanor said quietly. "He is our employer. We owe him everything. It would not be appropriate to presume." "To presume what? That a good man might fall for a good woman? That two lonely people might find comfort in each other?" Clara reached over and gripped Eleanor's hand. "You have spent your whole life taking care of me, of Mother. When do you get to think about what you want?" "I want you safe and healthy," Eleanor said firmly. "That is enough." But that night, as they sat around the table after dinner, Eleanor could not stop thinking about Clara's words. She found herself hyper-aware of James's presence, of the way the lamplight caught in his hair, of the deep timbre of his voice as he told them about a problem with one of the grazing pastures. When his hand accidentally brushed hers as they both reached for the coffee pot, electricity seemed to jump between them, and their eyes met and held for a long moment before Eleanor looked away, her heart pounding. "Eleanor," James said, and something in his voice made her look up. "Could I speak with you on the porch? Privately?" Anxiety spiked through her even as something else, hope perhaps, fluttered in her chest. She nodded and followed him outside where the night air was cool and sweet with the scent of pine. The sky was a wash of stars, more than she had ever seen in town, and for a moment they both just stood there, looking up at the vastness of it. "I need to tell you something," James said finally, his voice low, "and I hope you will forgive me if I am overstepping." Eleanor's breath caught. "What is it?" "These past 6 weeks with you and Clara here, they have been the happiest I can remember in years. Coming home is not a chore anymore. It is something I look forward to all day. The house feels like a home instead of just a building. And you—" He turned to face her fully, and even in the darkness she could see the intensity in his eyes. "You are remarkable, Eleanor Hayes. Your strength, your kindness, the way you love your sister, the way you have made this place come alive. I find myself making excuses to come back to the house in the middle of the day just for a chance to see you. I think about you when I'm working. I dream about you at night." Eleanor's heart was thundering so hard she was certain he must hear it. "James, I know I am your employer," he continued quickly, as if afraid she would stop him. "I know there is a power imbalance there, and I would never want you to feel pressured or obligated. If you do not share my feelings, we can forget I said anything and continue as we have been. Your position here is secure regardless. I give you my word on that. But I had to tell you, I had to let you know that somewhere along the way I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "So afraid that what I was feeling was just gratitude, or that I was imagining the way you looked at me. I told myself I had no right to hope for anything beyond what you had already given us." "What are you feeling?" James asked, and she heard the vulnerability in his voice, the fear of rejection from a man who had been brave enough to speak his heart. "I'm feeling like the luckiest woman alive," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. "Because against all odds and logic, I have fallen in love with you too, James Garrett. With your kindness and your strength, and the way you honor your sister's memory by helping others, With your terrible coffee and your love of bad jokes and the way you leave wildflowers on the table like offerings, I love you. And it terrifies me because I have so little to offer in return." She did not get to finish because James closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses, and kissed her. It was a kiss of hope and promise, of loneliness finding its end, of two battered hearts recognizing each other and choosing to be brave together. Eleanor's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady thunder of his heartbeat, and she kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding in. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I should probably court you properly, bring you flowers and take you to dances in town, but Eleanor, I do not want to waste another moment. I want to build a life with you. I want to give you and Clara a real home, a real family. I want to fall asleep beside you every night and wake up to your face every morning. Marry me." "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." From inside the house, they heard Clara's delighted squeal, and they both laughed, realizing she had been listening at the window. "Your sister approves, at least," James said, grinning. "My sister is wise beyond her years," Eleanor replied, and kissed him again. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Prescott. Eleanor wore a new dress that James insisted on buying her, a soft blue calico that brought out her eyes. Clara stood beside her as her witness, glowing with health and happiness. James's foreman and several of the ranch hands attended, along with a scattering of townspeople who knew James and welcomed Eleanor into their community with warm smiles. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when James kissed her in front of everyone, Eleanor felt a completeness she had never known she was missing. This man, this good, honest man who had seen her at her lowest and offered her not pity but partnership, he was hers now, and she was his. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up outside and food enough to feed everyone twice over. The ranch hands produced fiddles and guitars, and there was music and dancing as the sun set over the mountains. James led Eleanor in a waltz, his hand warm on her waist, his eyes never leaving her face. "Happy?" he murmured. "Beyond words," she replied. "Thank you, James, for everything. For seeing me, for believing in me, for loving me." "Thank you for stealing that bread," he said with a wry smile. "Best thing that ever happened to me." That night, after all the guests had left or retired to the bunkhouse, after Clara had gone to sleep in what was now her own small bedroom, James carried Eleanor over the threshold of what was now truly their bedroom. He set her down gently, his hands trembling slightly with emotion and restraint. "I have waited for you my whole life," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "I did not even know I was waiting, but I was. And now you are here, and you are mine, and I'm never going to stop being grateful for that." Eleanor reached up and pulled him down into a kiss that started gentle and grew deeper, more urgent. They came together with tenderness and passion, with the awkwardness of new lovers learning each other and the rightness of two souls finally finding their match. James was careful with her, reverent, and Eleanor gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest and his heartbeat steady in her ear, Eleanor felt a peace she had never known. The fear and hunger and desperation that had haunted her for so long had been replaced by safety and fullness and hope. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," James replied, his arms tightening around her. "Forever, Eleanor Garrett." The months that followed were the happiest of Eleanor's life. She threw herself into making the ranch not just functional, but beautiful, planting flowers around the porch, sewing curtains for the windows, turning the house into a true home. Clara flourished in the clean air and steady routine, growing strong and healthy, helping with the household tasks and beginning to learn to ride the gentler horses. James was an attentive husband, never taking Eleanor for granted, always finding small ways to show his love. He taught her to ride properly, laughing when she nearly fell off her first attempts, but patient as she gained confidence. They would ride out together in the evening sometimes, just the two of them, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson while the cattle grazed peacefully around them. Winter came, and with it snow that blanketed the ranch in white. James had been right that the work was harder in the cold months, but Eleanor found a certain beauty in it. The crackling fire in the hearth, the warmth of James's body beside hers at night, the satisfaction of keeping everyone fed and warm despite the harsh weather. It was in early spring, when the snow was melting and the first green shoots were appearing in the garden, that Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but waited to be certain before telling James. When she finally told him over breakfast one morning, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, wonder, a hint of fear, before settling on a grin so wide it made her laugh. "A baby," he said, his voice awed. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Eleanor confirmed, and then she was in his arms being spun around the kitchen while he laughed like a child. Clara was equally delighted when they told her, immediately beginning to make plans for the nursery and knit tiny clothes. The ranch hands, when they found out, treated Eleanor with even more care than usual, competing to help with any task that might be too strenuous for her condition. The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor was sick most mornings, and the summer heat made her uncomfortable. But James was endlessly patient, bringing her cool water, rubbing her swollen feet, reading to her in the evenings. He built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving their initials and a small horse into the headboard. Their son was born on a cold November morning in 1884, after a labor that lasted through the night. James held Eleanor's hand the entire time, his face pale but determined. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, James cried openly. They named him Samuel after James's father, and from the moment Eleanor held him, she knew what it meant to have her heart walking around outside her body. Samuel had James's dark hair and Eleanor's blue eyes, and both his parents were utterly besotted. Clara proved to be a wonderful aunt, doting on the baby and helping with his care. Watching her sister hold Samuel, seeing the life and health that had returned to Clara over the past year and a half, Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. "Thank you," she said to James one night, as they lay in bed with Samuel sleeping in his cradle beside them. "For all of this, for saving us, for giving us a family." "You saved me too," James replied quietly. "I was just going through the motions before you came. Now I am actually living. You and Clara and Samuel, you are my purpose, my joy. I am the one who should be thanking you." "Then we will just keep thanking each other," Eleanor said with a smile and kissed him. The years that followed brought more blessings. A daughter, Emma, arrived when Samuel was 2, with blonde curls like Clara and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone. Then another son, David, 2 years after that, who proved to be quieter but deeply thoughtful. The ranch prospered under James's careful management and Eleanor's efficient household. They expanded the house, adding more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. They hired more hands as the herd grew. James became known throughout the territory as a fair employer and a shrewd cattleman. Clara, now in her early 20s and fully recovered from her childhood frailty, eventually married one of the neighboring ranchers, a kind young man named Thomas who had been courting her for over a year. She moved to his ranch 5 miles away, close enough to visit often, and Eleanor cried happy tears at her sister's wedding, remembering the pale, starving girl Clara had been and marveling at the strong, radiant woman she had become. When Eleanor turned 30, James surprised her with a party, inviting all their friends and neighbors, celebrating not just her birthday but the life they had built together. As she stood on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard while James's arm wrapped around her waist, Eleanor thought back to that desperate day in Prescott when she had tried to steal bread. She had been so afraid then, so certain that the world held nothing but hardship and loss. But that moment of desperation had led her here, to this life full of love and purpose and joy. James had not just given her and Clara a job or even a home. He had given them a future, a family, a place to belong. "What are you thinking about, Isinta?" James asked, pulling her closer. "How far we have come," Eleanor said softly. "How that terrible day turned into the best thing that ever happened to me." "Fate," James said with a smile, "or luck, or divine intervention. I do not much care what we call it, as long as I get to keep you." "Forever," Eleanor promised. The same promise they had made to each other on their wedding day and renewed countless times since. "You are stuck with me forever, James Garrett." "Best fate I could imagine," he replied, and kissed her as the sun set over their land, painting everything in golden light. The children grew as children do. Samuel proved to have a natural gift with horses and cattle, following his father everywhere, learning the ranch business from the ground up. Emma had her mother's practical nature and her father's stubborn determination, and could outwork most of the ranch hands by the time she was 14. David, the quietest of the three, surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for books and numbers, keeping the ranch accounts with meticulous care. Clara had 3 children of her own, 2 boys and a girl, and the cousins grew up together, spending long summer days running wild across the rangeland, learning to ride and rope and work. The 2 families gathered for every holiday, creating traditions and memories that would last lifetimes. As the years passed and the new century dawned, bringing changes to the West, James and Eleanor changed too. Their hair silvered, their faces lined with the marks of years spent squinting into the sun and laughing at dinner tables, but their love remained constant, the foundation on which everything else was built. James never forgot to leave wildflowers on the table when they were in season. Eleanor never stopped making sure his coffee was perfect every morning. They still rode out together on summer evenings, now followed by grandchildren on ponies. They still talked for hours about everything and nothing, never running out of things to say to each other. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and Clara's family organized a grand celebration. The entire community seemed to turn out, filling the ranch yard with laughter and music. As James led Eleanor in a waltz, just as he had at their wedding, she marveled at how young he still made her feel, how his touch still sent warmth through her after all these years. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" Eleanor asked as they danced. "When you asked me to marry you?" "I told you I did not want to waste another moment," James replied, "that I wanted to build a life with you." "We built something pretty wonderful," Eleanor said, her eyes sweeping over their children, their grandchildren, their home, their friends, all the fruits of that decision to be brave, to take a chance on love. "We did," James agreed, "and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it, as long as it was with you." More years passed, bringing both joys and sorrows, as is the way of life. They mourned the loss of friends and ranch hands who had become family. They celebrated weddings and births, watched their grandchildren grow and start families of their own. They faced droughts and harsh winters, but the ranch endured, as did they. James taught his grandsons to rope and ride, passing on the skills his own father had taught him. Eleanor taught her granddaughters to cook and sew, but also to be strong, to speak their minds, to never let anyone make them feel small. And both grandparents made sure every child knew the story of how they met, how one act of compassion had changed everything, how love could bloom even in desperate circumstances. Clara remained Eleanor's closest confidant through all the years, the 2 sisters inseparable despite living on different ranches. They would sit together on Eleanor's porch in the late afternoons, shelling peas or snapping beans, talking about everything under the sun. Sometimes they spoke of their mother, of the hard years before they came to Prescott, and Eleanor would think about the girl she had been, so desperate and afraid. "I wish Mother could have seen this," Clara said one day, her hands busy with her knitting. Seen us both so happy, so settled. She would be proud, Eleanor replied, of both of us, of how we survived. We did more than survive, Clara corrected gently. We thrived. Because of you, Ellie. You were the one who was brave enough to try to save us, even if it meant stealing. And James was the one who saw that bravery and offered us a chance. Eleanor looked out over the ranch, at the life she and James had built, and had to agree. They had not just survived, they had created something beautiful. James was in his early 70s when his health began to fail. It started small, a persistent cough, a loss of appetite, but gradually worsened despite the doctor's best efforts. Eleanor nursed him with fierce devotion, refusing to leave his side, just as he had never left hers through 3 difficult childbirths and every illness their children had suffered. On a warm spring evening, with the windows open to let in the scent of wildflowers and the whole family gathered, James took Eleanor's hand in his. "I am not afraid," he said, his voice weak but steady. "I have had a good life, better than I ever dreamed. You gave me that, Eleanor. You and our children and this life we built." "Do not talk like that," Eleanor said, though tears streamed down her face. "You are going to be fine. You have to be fine." "We both know that is not true," James said gently, "but it is all right. I am ready. I just need you to know. Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. That day in the general store when I saw you, scared but brave, desperate but determined, I knew you were special. I just did not know you would become everything." "You saved me," Eleanor whispered, pressing his hand to her cheek. "No," James corrected, his eyes holding hers with the same intensity they had 47 years ago. "We saved each other." He died peacefully that night, surrounded by everyone he loved, with Eleanor's hand in his until his last breath. The grief was profound, a physical ache that Eleanor carried in her chest. But even in her sorrow, she felt gratitude for the years they had been given, for the love that had sustained her through everything. James had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams, and the best way to honor him was to keep living it fully. She stayed on the ranch, now run by Samuel with help from his siblings. She played with her great-grandchildren, taught them to make bread, and told them stories about their great-grandfather. She tended her garden and visited Clara and watched the seasons turn, finding peace in the rhythms of ranch life. On what would have been their 50th anniversary, Eleanor rode out to the spot where she and James used to watch the sunset. She was older now, slower, but still capable. She sat there on her horse as the sky turned gold and crimson, and she talked to James as if he were beside her. "We did it," she said softly. "We built that life you promised me. We raised good children who are raising good children of their own. The ranch is thriving, and I loved you every single day, James Garrett. I still do." The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers, and Eleanor smiled. She knew with a certainty that defied logic that somewhere, somehow, James was smiling too. Eleanor lived 5 more years, remaining sharp and active until the end. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 74, in the bed she had shared with James, in the house that had become her home when she needed one most. At her funeral, attended by what seemed like half the territory, the minister told the story of how James and Eleanor met. He spoke of compassion and courage, of love that transformed lives, of how one act of kindness in a general store had rippled out to touch hundreds of people. Samuel, speaking at his mother's grave, said simply, "She taught us that hardship does not define you. How you respond to it does. That love is always worth the risk. That family is not just blood, but the people who stand beside you when everything else falls apart." She was the strongest person I ever knew, and I am proud to be her son. They buried Eleanor beside James on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains and the grazing cattle, and the life they had built together. The headstone read, Eleanor Hayes Garrett, 1861 to 1935, beloved wife, mother, and friend. And beneath that, she was brave. But the story did not end there. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations, each one adding to the legacy. Samuel's children ran it, then his grandchildren. The original house was preserved, kept exactly as Eleanor had arranged it, a reminder of where it all started. And always, every summer, the family gathered for a reunion. They came from all over. Ranchers and lawyers, teachers and doctors, all descended from Eleanor and James or from Clara and Thomas. They told the old stories, passing them down to the youngest generation, making sure no one forgot how it all began. How one desperate woman tried to steal bread to save her sister. How one compassionate cowboy saw past the crime to the courage beneath. How that moment of connection became a love that lasted a lifetime and created a legacy that would endure for generations. In the general store in Prescott, long after it had been renovated and modernized, there hung a small plaque. It told the story of what had happened there in July of 1883, how an act of kindness had changed lives. Tourists would read it and smile, touched by the romance of it. Locals would pass it and nod, knowing the story intimately, proud that their town had been where it all began. And sometimes on summer evenings when the light slanted gold across the land, if you stood on the porch of the Garrett Ranch and listened carefully, you could almost hear it, the echo of laughter, the sound of children playing, the low murmur of conversation between two people who loved each other beyond measure. Eleanor Hayes had walked into that general store in 1883 expecting to be arrested, possibly jailed, maybe hanged. Instead, she found everything she had never dared to dream of: safety, purpose, love, family, home. She had been caught stealing bread to feed her starving sister. The cowboy had paid for it and hired them both instead. And from that simple act of compassion grew a love story that defied the hardships of the Wild West and proved that sometimes, in the darkest moments, fate brings you exactly who you need. Their story became legend in the territory, passed down through generations as proof that goodness exists, that love endures, that one moment of kindness can change the entire trajectory of a life. And it all started with a loaf of bread, a desperate woman, and a cowboy who chose compassion over judgment. That, in the end, was the real legacy of James and Eleanor Garrett, not just the ranch they built or the children they raised, but the reminder they left behind that we all have the power to change someone's life if only we are brave enough to extend a hand when someone needs it most.